So glad to see members of Farmington community here. I'm Andrew Clark, and I direct the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at UConn. And we have been serving as the administrative body that helps provide some assistance to the task force, the Police Transparency and Accountability Task Force, and it has since 2019. The task force actually originated from a 2019 state statute, but it only really gained some prominence after George Floyd. The legislature, the Connecticut legislature, really went into lockdown, and the only bill that passed in 2020, as I'm sure many folks are familiar with, is the Police Accountability Bill. Part of that bill was giving the task force, which is comprised of 13 members, 4 of which will be here tonight, and additional things to take a look at and make recommendations back to the General Assembly. Our final report is due very shortly, and as part of this process, what we've been doing is having community listening sessions. We started right after July 2020 when we got the new charge for the task force to have all virtual listening sessions, frankly. We had some in September, we had some in November, then in the following year, 2021, the beginning of this year, we had them in February and March. And all of those you can see on the Police Transparency website, which you can see here, ctpolicetransparency.com. And so all the while, we've been meeting virtually and coming up with some recommendations on the 13 items that the task force was to take a look at. We're going to focus on 2 of those tonight. One is diversity in policing. So the task force was asked to take a look at the issue of diversity relative to gender and relative to race and ethnicity. As we continued those conversations, it was apparent that we needed to have disability statuses in there as well. And that's because one of the few commissions or task force that I've been a part of actually specifically had a charge to take a look at police interactions with the disability community. So we created a subcommittee. The chair is here today, John Slifka, and we came up with recommendations on those interactions that are now going to be part of the final report. And so what we're going to do is talk a little bit about those tonight. We're going to have some presentations on what exactly those are. Then we have a moderated conversation with some of the task force members, but then we really want to hear from you. And what are your thoughts and feelings on this particular topic? And what do you think the task force is missing, or what are we doing right? And then we'll go from there. And these are part of a series of 3. Tomorrow night we're going to be in Hartford Public Library from 6 to 8 p.m. Last night we were in West Hartford Public Library from 6 to 8 p.m. We will most likely have some more in January. With the way things are going, I'm guessing those will be virtual. But we did want to have some, because we always aspire to have some in-person dialogue, because we know how important that is in creating connection and relationships. And we're glad to have been able to pull this off. So without further ado, I'd like to bring in the star of that show over there. And one of our stars tonight, Dr. Anee Kringen. And she, it mentioned she was an officer in Virginia, correct? And then now is down in Austin, Texas. But in the meantime, she was a professor, and still is actually, at the University of New Haven. And she worked with us at the IMRP on a separate project. And as we were getting this work underway with the task force, it turns out that her real expertise is in the diversity in policing. So she's been assisting the task force with the research that Dr. Goff was talking about, the things that we need to know and understand and potentially track as we're making recommendations about this particular issue. So Dr. Kringen will present for about 10 minutes and then be followed by, this is the recommendations coming out of the Public Awareness Subcommittee, and then those will be followed by a presentation by Meghan Peterson.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for having me here. I was able to make it in from Austin on Sunday. Was slightly surprised at how many more people are traveling than I had thought, but I guess that is good in certain ways. But I'm happy to be here. One of the things that I think is really valuable to understand about this conversation and about the session tonight is that while we're learning from other departments, one of the reasons is because a lot of the things that we are going to be discussing here, while we're focused on the state of Connecticut, are part of the narrative of everything that's going on in policing right now, right? So I think the strength of sort of understanding is, I've worked with currently now Austin Police Department, but I've also done projects with the LA Sheriff's Department and various other agencies to really understand what are the things that they're doing well, how are they tackling some of these problems, and then I think more importantly as a researcher by training, some of the ways to think about this are what are the studies that are actually out there that we actually think will improve outcome, right? And so I'll go over some of the research on that really briefly, but thank you again so much for having me here. So first, when we talk about racial diversity, I have up here the statistics for the national composition. However, within Connecticut, we actually find that it's a little bit less diverse, with about 80% of the population being white officers. However, it's a little bit more diverse when it comes to actually the larger agencies. So larger agencies are about 12% Black, 16 and almost 16% Hispanic, and a little bit under 1% Asian. And so one of the things that we just want to sort of the later or the newer research in this area has demonstrated that Black and Hispanic officers are less likely to actually utilize force. So it's something that we think of when we think about racial diversity. The other way that I also want us to think about racial diversity that is usually utilized to understand is the idea of representative bureaucracy, right? If you work in a community of color, right, seeing an officer who looks like you is an advantage. It allows you to understand, maybe this person understands my background, maybe they understand cultural norms, right? And so this is a positive aspect about racial diversity within law enforcement. And this is sort of my research area, specifically women in policing, right? Where there are various studies that demonstrate that female officers are more likely to de-escalate, better communication skills, right? And I think about that in terms of problem solving, right? Is that they bring different backgrounds, and same with racial diversity, to understanding certain problems. But nationally, we're about 12% female officers nationally. Larger agencies, once again, have usually a greater percentage of female officers. But also, along the same line, there are a lot of kind of reasons to unpack why women are either not attracted to these particular positions or that there are actual barriers that don't allow them to get either into positions or be able to promote once they're in these particular positions. So these are some of the studies and some of the outcomes related to diversity in gender. And then perhaps what I think is probably one of the most valuable reasons about thinking about diversity and actually having concrete strategies about diversification within law enforcement is this idea of ideology, right? Is that in the end, if you have different ways of thinking about things, right, you're less likely to have groupthink and discussions. And so can we actually have officers who have those discussions internally, right, so that we're not constantly going out to community, getting negative feedback or getting feedback about what needs to be improved, where you can be having those conversations internally in agencies to come up with better solutions. And so there's a lot of evidence that supports that this idea of having ideology diversification is really important for organization health. So this brings us to our recommendations and some of the things that we really kind of thought through to make sure that we weren't just sort of talking about diversity as a buzzword, but more what are the concrete things that we want to recommend to ensure that this is not just an idea, but it can become an action, right? And then we can also think about what are the resources to actually make sure that this happens, right? So in the end, one of the things that we did put in was CALEA, which is the body that really does the certification for the particular state, right? But that there is accreditation through the state, and can we tie the idea of community involvement into the accreditation process, right? And so the agencies, to be accredited, have to demonstrate that there's some type of community involvement. In Austin Police Department, we have a curriculum committee where we meet actually twice a month with community members to discuss curriculum. But there are also other types of community involvement of saying, hey, we're getting feedback on some of the things that we're doing, and that other departments do community involvement that tends to be a little bit less, I don't want to say collaborative in a physical sense, but where they're getting feedback constantly on policy and those types of things, really soliciting that, right? And so that departments could decide what's working for them and what are the ways in which they get feedback, right? And then that would be built into the accreditation process. The second recommendation is really related to what I often see as one of the challenges to diversification, which is really what are the barriers and then what are the ways in which you can think about these things as promising practices. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of research about what works, right? Like normally we'd think you have to have a randomized control trial to actually demonstrate that this particular intervention has produced a specific outcome, right? And that's really hard in some of the areas, especially like recruiting where you're hiring people, right? Or hiring where you would have to be able to demonstrate why you're not hiring and you have legal ramifications, right? And so one of the things that we really wanted to make part of our recommendations is giving agencies the kind of promising practices. We don't use best practices, right? But promising practices where there's some research that supports that these things can perhaps help them diversify, as opposed to just saying, hey, we have this outcome that we want you to achieve, but we haven't given you the tools or the resources to know how to do that, right? So at the state level, it would be giving those types of tools and resources and promising practices out to agencies to help them think about how to build their diversity, equity, inclusion plans. And then finally, this last part, since we've discussed the idea that community engagement will be part of accreditation, is also within POST having a diversity, equity, inclusion unit or position within compliance, right? And so being able to say, hey, we want you to have plans that you're submitting, right? So it wouldn't be you have to meet a certain target necessarily of demographics within your particular agency, but saying you have a plan, you're following some of these promising practices, you're able to actually demonstrate and measure some of these things, and these are the ways in which we would start kind of moving us towards actually being able to measure changes in this area. And so this is sort of my love, requiring data analysis and collection, which is really, really important, and standardizing it across agencies. And then the last recommendation, and I think it was touched on, and I know we're about to have another presentation that will really dive into this particular area related to kind of social work, but what is civilian staff within agencies doing, right? It's really interesting to me that there's actually, well, the LEMIS data for the law enforcement management collects sworn information, right, on demographics, is that I actually have no understanding on a national level what the civilian population that works within agencies demographically looks like, right? But also, what do they do, right? So we may know from watching 60 Minutes, hey, this is something that Austin does, right? But we don't actually know whether it's in the state and nationally what civilian individuals are doing. And so one of the things that we really want to understand in this particular recommendation is, what are our civilian staff doing within law enforcement, right? What are their actual roles and functions? But also, what is diversity demographically, right, within those areas to think about? And so in the end, I sort of conclude by saying we really want your feedback on these particular recommendations and also our other recommendations to sort of think about, where are we missing the mark? Are these things that you believe are important, right, and valuable? and some of the stories that perhaps you have from your individual interaction with law enforcement here. And thank you so much for your time.
So we're going to save the questions for these two presentations until the moderated conversation with Dan Simpson. And now we're going to go to Dr. Meghan Peterson. Dr. Peterson, as Dr. Kringen was assisting the Public Awareness Subcommittee, was assisting the Improving Police Interactions with the Disability Subcommittee. And she's worked with us at the IMRP. And I think what's important to note here is the fact that as we're developing these policy recommendations, we're going to the evidence, we're going to the research, and we're letting that guide us in terms of what these recommendations are. So it was a fascinating, year and a half with Dr. Peterson as she was bringing this research back to the subcommittee and sharing it with us, and we were chewing on it and then making these recommendations. So she's going to talk a little bit about those today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Clark. Good evening, everyone. Meghan Peterson. I'm a researcher with the IMRP, and a few of my slides go over the legislative background for the task force, but that material has already been gone over with, so we can just fast forward. There are 3 subcommittees that comprise the task force: logistics, public awareness, and then the one that I'm helping to provide research and informational material for, the Improving Police Interactions with the Disability Community Subcommittee. And we're looking at individuals who have disabilities broadly defined. So when I speak of disability or disabilities, I mean it to include mental, intellectual, and physical disabilities. And included within that are also behavioral and developmental. So your visible but also non-visible disabilities that may be present. And so what the subcommittee has been looking at is looking at 4 areas of recommendations. But before we go into those, why are we here in the first place? So, as is often the case with media coverage, high-profile encounters between police and communities do not often play out the whole story. And so we are seeking to look at the deeper context for those interactions and fatal or injurious interactions between police and individuals who have disabilities. So nationwide, about 1 in 4 people have a disability or disabilities, whether they are visible or non-visible. In Connecticut, that's 1 in 5. And these are estimates, so they're simply that. The figures could be higher, and they are likely higher, because a lot of this data comes from 2019 for Connecticut and 2016 estimates for nationwide figures. Approximately 30 to 50% of fatal encounters between police and individuals, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, are those persons who have a disability or multiple disabilities. Again, whether they are visible or non-visible to the responding officer. A second data point that we have been looking at is the fact that 1 in 4 fatal encounters with police are placed by those individuals who have SMI, or serious mental illness. So that could be your non-visible, and then it becomes manifest on scene. And then another figure is 1 in 10 calls placed to 911 are placed by people who are in some sort of mental health crisis. So that's on your civilian disability community side. But then you also have the police law enforcement side. In short, law enforcement members may themselves also be members of the disability community. So that is where you get this connection or the nexus between law enforcement and then your civilian population, your disability population. So rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, depression are at 5 times higher than those who reside or identify with the civilian population. Another point is police and firefighters are more likely to die by suicide than in the line of duty or on the job, basically. So 4 areas that the IPIDC subcommittee has identified for research and examination are the role of social workers, voluntary registry system, police education and training, and finally the role of SROs or school resource officers. And I should note that the sequence of these recommendation sites that have been identified does not in any way signify that one is more important than the other. I will also note that as a matter of fact, we have, in the course of our research, seen the connections between them. So they are part of a system-wide approach to reformation. So the first, again, not in terms of importance, but just one that we have identified, is social workers. So the idea here is that you send a person who has specialized training in mental health, in responding to a person who is in crisis. And this is not to say that that person who is in mental crisis doesn't also have, let's say, a visible disability, like a physical disability. There are different models that we have seen across the United States, but also in Connecticut. One is the co-responder model, where you actually send a social worker or a licensed clinical social worker on scene with the officer. Another model calls for a second responder approach, where the police clears the scene of danger, and then the social worker or social workers, it could be a team, responds subsequently. Then there's also, which Connecticut actually has done a lot of work when it comes to this team structure approach, the critical intervention team. In some jurisdictions, it's actually called the critical incident team. But in essence, it's the same. It's a team approach. You send a police officer, a mental health professional, a psychiatrist, another emergency personnel as a team approach to respond to that person or persons in crisis who placed that 911 call. Then you have the voluntary registry system. This emphasis is on voluntary. So the idea here is that people who have disabilities, if they feel so inclined, if they feel comfortable, they provide that disability information to their local police department, either via mail, online, or some other method where that information is stored confidentially. And we have seen in the research that actually the online storage method is more secure than that in paper. And this has been implemented across the U.S. In Tilton, New Hampshire, there is actually a voluntary registry system. In Connecticut, we have several localities that have this system. Again, it's voluntary, so that person who has disabilities or that person's guardian can supply that information to that local PD. The idea being that if police have this information about that person, if that person makes a call, an emergency call, they will be better equipped to respond. And they will provide a more targeted approach, possibly bringing in that social worker rather than a police. Then you have police education and training. So we've been looking at, okay, how can we expand course offerings and curricula so that police are better equipped to provide a more tailored response if in fact they are responding as a first responder. Likewise, social workers could also be receiving more targeted training, so it's sort of this dual approach. We're better equipping police, we're better equipping social workers to respond. And then finally is school resource officers. We did not have enough time or adequate time to look at this and to give it due justice. But the idea here is that we've identified it as an area for further study. The concept being that the school resource officer is a responder to students, so your school-age population, who have a crisis during the school day. So these are 4 areas, and in many ways, I will reiterate, we see connection between all 4. Because if you have the role of the social worker, that is possibly providing for de-escalation, lessening of tension, reduction of violence. But it's not just a focus on reduction, right? You're also looking at, okay, what are we putting into place on a positive side? Well, possibly you're building more trust between your emergency personnel system. And that would provide feedback to the voluntary registry system, which is another tool, because if the community trusts their law enforcement, their local PD, their local social workers who are responding with the police, then maybe they'll supply that information. But it's predicated on conditions of trust. Ditto goes for the police education and training. You're better equipping your first responders, your second responders. And then finally, the school resource officers, it's connected down to the youth population. That it's not just the case that adults have disabilities, right? You have your youth who also have disabilities and may experience crisis during the school day on school premise. And so I want to extend genuine gratitude to all of you for being here. And so thank you very much. And I look forward to hearing any questions you may have.
I thought there were 3 really compelling items when we watched those 2 presentations. I wanted to see what you all thought. One, 80% of police calls are social work related. You know what? Before I'm starting off, I haven't introduced the panel. So let me do that. Before I do that, let me introduce the panel, and then we'll get into the 3 compelling points. We had Dr. Anee Kringen, who you saw, 60 Minutes. You saw she also was a former police officer. Her background is really pretty eclectic. She's the national expert on research on this topic, but also once a police officer. Her perspective is really unique. You heard from Dr. Meghan Peterson and her research. Her focus is on public law, political theory, and policing. That's her forte. We have Jonathan Slifka, who's the executive assistant to the commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Aging and Disability Services. He is the governor's liaison to the disability community, a real champion for increasing services and awareness about those with disabilities. Also joined by Maggie, if you don't mind, her name is Magdalena, but they call her Maggie Silver. She's the deputy chief of UConn Police Department, oversees several of UConn's campuses, 25 years in law enforcement, had a very non-traditional approach to getting into police. We talked about recruiting, how to get more people of color. She came from Puerto Rico in 1986, struggled with homelessness, was a single mom, and now she's deputy chief in UConn and has a PhD. So that's a remarkable story. I want to be her agent for her book, because that's a Netflix movie or HBO. You know, I haven't met her before, but that tells you a whole lot. Homelessness, single mom, coming from PR, being in the police department in executive leadership, and then getting a PhD. So you know there's an extraordinary story there, and just some perspective. So looking forward to hearing from her. We have Daryl McGraw. Daryl is chairman of the Connecticut's Police Transparency and Accountability Taskforce. He's a community organizer, activist, public speaker. Recently did a very popular TED Talk here in Hartford, very well received. He's a respected voice in Connecticut for criminal justice reform, and he's a former program director for Yale's Department of Psychiatry. And did I miss anyone? No, I think I have everyone. Okay, we had Jack Drum. We had Chief Jack Drum from Madison yesterday, and he couldn't make it today, but he had some very interesting perspectives from his standpoint as a chief in a town like Madison. So let me go back now to what I thought were really 3 compelling points from the presentation. One, 80% of calls are social work related. How many of you were struck by that? Anyone surprised? 80%. Because what's the one thing that most police officers say? Hey, I didn't come here to be a social worker. I'm a cop. But 80% of the calls are social work related. Number 2, we found through the study, through the data, that Latino, African American, Asian, cops of color, and women are less likely to use force than their white peers. Again, a very compelling stat. What does that mean? We get your thoughts and hear the panelists as well. And number 3, 30 to 50% of people who die in police interactions had some sort of disability. So I thought those are really three powerful, engaging points of the presentations. So let's start with Chief. We'll start with your compelling story. You've heard all the different talks and angles on this. What are your thoughts? Let's focus on right now diversity of police force. How did you as a chief get attracted to law enforcement? Because everything about your background would say, well, we're not going to picture law enforcement, right? From Puerto Rico, homelessness, single mom, what appealed to you to be a police officer?
So, in all reality, nothing. Because of my background, because being a single mom, homeless in the inner city, I had a lot of negative interactions with police. And I hated the police officers. I did not like them. And I decided that I was going to go to school because I wanted it better and I understood that education was the way to get where I needed to go. So I had a great social worker in the welfare office who assisted me to go back to college. And from there, I decided I was going to be an attorney that was going to prosecute those cops who harass people like me in the neighborhood. But, I also learned as I got more education that there are two sides to each story. I started looking into law enforcement, and I decided that sometimes when you want to make changes to systems, you need to make change by joining the system and working from the inside. To be in the outside, just pointing the finger and saying you are a problem, but not looking to those solutions, you're not really helping anyone. So that's how I came to become a law enforcement officer. I wasn't sure that I was going to last this long, but I have. I have had some wonderful experiences, and I always think of me back when I was 19 years old, homeless, and whenever I deal with someone. And I know how I wanted to be treated, and that's what I let my officers know, that I want them to treat everyone with respect and with dignity. And that's why I joined the police force.
Yeah, fascinating. Daryl and I were having a conversation yesterday about recruiting, police departments recruiting, and what's the pitch? How do you recruit an urban kid or kid of color to police if their perception is, as the chief here said? And Daryl was saying that really you got to sell the pitch on be part of the change, be part of the solution. You can step back and complain about it, or have an opportunity to come inside and be part of the leadership that changes all the things you're very frustrated about. Chief, I want to stay with you for a second. That same stat, why are officers of color and women, according to the stats, less likely to use force in their daily interactions?
I think that our experiences are different. I think that often we take a step back and can relate better. And when you relate better, when you have that relationship, whenever I dealt with someone, I always understood that where they're coming from, right? I know how angry 19-year-old with me, homeless, was every time I got moved along and I was treated with disrespect. When I wasn't doing anything, I wasn't selling drugs, I wasn't making a problem. So I understand that respect is the key. And therefore, I understand when people feel disrespected and why they might. And I try to meet them halfway. And I think that for individuals of colors, we all have experiences that can connect with the community a lot better.
Jonathan Slifka, again, disability community advocate, a real champion for increasing services. When you hear that 80% of calls for police work are mostly social work related, what does that tell you on your platform?
I think it tells you two things. If you're calling the police for calls that could otherwise be handled by a social worker, there's a shortage of social workers. And I'm not sure that's just in Connecticut. I'm sure that is across the country. The exponential increase in mental health crises and mental health disabilities in this country, I think, speaks to that. The other thing I think it says is we are putting too much of the burden of that responsibility on our police when it should not be there. And I think the presentations that, including the great 60-minute piece, highlighted that tremendously tonight.
Do you see a correlation between 30 to 50% of people die with interactions of folks who have some sort of disability. Can you speak to that?
How much time do you have? I mean, well, it's because as we mentioned last night, Stan, that the disability community is a nuanced community. You have visible disabilities. You have invisible disabilities. You have disabilities that can present in extreme ways, and disabilities that can present in very mild ways. There's a reason it's called, for example, autism spectrum disorder. You can be on one end of the spectrum, or you can be on the other. And if officers are not trained adequately to recognize behaviors, recognize signs, and recognize specific patterns of behavior in someone that might have a disability that you are not necessarily aware has one, when you arrive at a situation, particularly a situation in crisis, you're tipping the scales in a direction where it could end in a bad result.
So hypothetically, a person who is not very adept at looking you in the eye, or maybe has sudden movements, or maybe seems like they're not engaged, an officer could take that as someone being disrespectful when somebody who has a disability.
They could, at a minimum, disrespectful, Stan. They could take that as someone that's being hostile, and someone that could then go from there to a more escalated behavior. And that's dangerous.
Thank you. Daryl McGraw, leadership and training. Let's talk about intentionality. We're talking about the issue of diversity and being empathetic with folks with disabilities and just the whole community. Let's talk about leadership and training and how those two are important elements to all this.
Oh, I appreciate the question, Stan. Appreciate this panel. Farmington, you guys are, man, we got deputy chief, person of color that, that grew up in, in the hood where I come from. I'm an impacted person, so I've experienced my lived experience. I've experienced having been assaulted by the police, right? So that's been my experience. And then having John and then two, professors here, that are speaking to the thing. I think this is a great panel. So when we start to talk about leadership, when we look at Deputy Chief Silver, and she talks about having that lived experience, I'm always going to talk about lived experience first. And lived experience is important, right? Being able to speak to that, being able to not just speak from what's right for leaders to do, but actually speak from I was that person. So let me tell you what that was like. So my role, even in this, as the chair of the Police Accountability, I bring in my leadership ability, I bring my lived experience to the table, what it was like to be a young black man growing up in an urban environment. My interactions with the police weren't always pleasant. More than most, they have been negative. But I'm not bringing that to the table as from an adversarial point. I'm bringing it so we can educate the public as well as officers that are in leadership roles, so we can revisit how they lead moving forward, because maybe their experiences are different than mine. So how does that work? So and I think, just to answer your question, great leadership comes from listening, right? Those that are willing to listen first, not just to lead by listening first, and then implementing the next piece of change. Thank you.
We have three doctors on the panel, so I want to direct it now to two of the three, Dr. Kringen and Kringen. I keep butchering your name, Kringen.
Kringen.
I call Dr. Ann.
Yeah, that also works.
Dr. Ann, Dr. Megan, keeps it simple, don't embarrass myself. Dr. Ann, Dr. Megan. We're in Farmington, right? And some may say, hey, this is a great academic exercise. We're seeing the importance of diversity. Yeah, this is great, but we're in Farmington. We really don't need diversity. We're a nice, tawny, affluent suburb, and this is more for Hartford or Waterbury. We're good here. We're fine how things are. Response.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because a lot of times when we talk about diversity within police departments, the original language, and I worked with International Association Chiefs of Police when they were coming out with their statement, and they said to match the community that the police department is surveying. And I was like, well, that might be a problem, right? Like I said, for example, in a in Connecticut, where we have a lot of racial segregation, right, and socioeconomic segregation, right, we would essentially be saying, well, it's okay to have a mostly white police department if your town is mostly white, right? And then that goes back to, you know, the presentation, which is it's about bringing those backgrounds and experiences that allow you to think about problems differently, right? And often within policing, when I've worked with organizations and I say, well, why do we do it this way? They say, I don't know, we've always done it this way, right? And part of it is bringing other people to the table to say, hey, what if you did it some other way, right? Can we consider that? And I often talk to, you know, the officers that I work with, and I say, hey, if you can give me a compelling reason, we don't need to change just to change it, right? I don't need to come in and be the only change agent, but we do need to be able to actually articulate and defend why we do this. Is this a promising practice? Is it a best practice? What is the evidence that supports this, right? And so I think it always pivots back to having other people at the table who have a different background, who can see problems in a different way. And on top of that, just because this may be the community that lives here, doesn't mean it's the community that works here or commutes here or, you know, spends, you know, time and money in this particular community. And so making sure that we think about not just the population that, you know, lives here, but also those who also, you know, spend considerable time here as well.
Dr. Maggie, your thoughts? Why should a Farmington, I'm sorry, Dr. Maggie. Dr.
Maybe.
Dr. Maggie.
Another M.
I'm doing a great job as moderator, right? I'm gonna get to you in a second, Chief. But Dr. Maggie, same question. With Simsbury, Farmington, Avon, yeah, we get this diversity stuff, but you know, we're comfortable here. We're good.
You know, that's a great question, Stan. I'm reminded of this past summer in doing this research, there was actually a case of a man with Down syndrome several years ago. His name is Ethan Saylor, and he died in the course of an encounter with police. He was actually forcibly removed from a movie theater. He had finished watching the movie, and then he really loved it. It was, and he was so excited. He actually returned back to the movie theater. At which point, 3 sheriffs brought him out forcibly, and he died of asphyxiation. And subsequent to that, the family of Ethan Saylor actually took it upon themselves to communicate with law enforcement. And what they did was so on point and genuine, because what they did was they actually petitioned the police to provide for hands-on training with people who have disabilities, not just with those who have Down syndrome, but people who have autism, people who have physical disabilities. And to this day, it's the Ethan Saylor Alliance, and every year they have trainings. And so to go to your question, to my mind, it begins with the inclusion of those voices, whatever they are, in whatever community you are in. So you could be a toady town, you could be an urban setting, but when it comes down to it, these are real people, these are real encounters, these are real incidents, and there are people who respond to that and engage in communication with law enforcement, with social workers, and they get the job done. And so the family of Ethan Saylor is just a very specific example of that when you include those voices.
Dr. Chief Maggie, when I got interested in the whole criminal justice front, it was years ago as a journalist when I realized 3 important things about the inmate population here in Connecticut. 75% of the inmates were Black and Latino. 75% in the state where the population was probably 30% of Black and Latino. So that's a huge disparity. 75% in prison, yet only 32% in the state.
14.
What's that?
14.
Being corrected, but anyways, 75% of the inmates were Black and Latino. 75% came from urban areas, Waterbury, Bridgeport, Hartford, and 75% did not finish high school, didn't have a high school diploma. And I started to see the whole connection of education, the whole pipeline. But that struck me years ago as a journalist, and I always was like, why is it happening here in Connecticut? And it wasn't just here in Connecticut. There are other states with similar demographics, those huge disparities. Your thoughts, Chief, on what those stats mean?
Well, I think that a lot of it has to do with, the people that look like you, right? I was fortunate that I had a father that taught me that education was the way to succeed. He didn't follow that example, but at least he said the words to me over and over. But unfortunately, for these minorities in the Waterbury, Bridgeport areas, they don't see, when they look at education, if they think of college, for example, and I work a lot with the ComCap program, which lost a lot of funding this past year, which is students first generation going to college. They need to see people like them. They have been educated. And that's not just about color and race, it's about disabilities. They need to see people like them that are going to college, that they are getting an education, because then they see that opportunity. But a lot of them don't have that hope, because they don't see people that look like them. They don't see the opportunities. The resources are not there teaching them. And ComCap program is a perfect example. It's a program that reaches out to students that are first generation in inner cities to tell them, yes, you can go to college. You're a single mom, you still can go to college, and lost this funding. So we need to think about what those resources look like and how we teach those individuals in the community that even if you make a mistake, if you go to jail, you have a kid, whatever that is, there's hope for you to advance. And getting educated, that's where it starts.
Education is the key. I want you all to join the conversation. Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question. I'll see you, stand up and fire away. Daryl McGraw, I want you to continue on those stats. 75%, this was years ago, and still today, 75% of the inmates, Black Latino, 75% from urban centers, and 75% shared one thing: never finished high school.
Yeah, and I didn't want to stand to my friend, so I'm not correcting you. I respect you, Steve, as a friend and a journalist. But I wanted to show that racial disparity is real, right? And then regardless of the fact that how you slice those numbers, Black and brown people only make up a small portion of Connecticut. Yeah, we make up a large portion of the prison system. I was one of them. Inmate number 183422, right? So understanding that, and similar to what Deputy Chief was talking about, there's so many components to this conversation. When we start to talk about survival, we're talking about feeding our families, and there's so much disparities all the way around in Connecticut. When we had an event last night, and I actually took the wrong turn, and I ended up driving through Manchester, which was really scary for me because the houses were getting bigger and bigger, and I knew that I did not belong in that area. As some people would be more scared of driving down Albany Avenue, I get scared when I'm driving in neighborhoods that I can't afford to live in, and it's the same fear, right? So I think about that, and I also go back to my own personal story of what does success look like in those communities, right? For me, the drug dealers were successful. That's what success looked like. So that's the only form of success that I saw. And I mentioned this in another talk that I do, where if I lived in a blue collar community where next door Mike's Plumbing and John's Electric or so on and so forth, those people appear to be successful. So would success look different to me if I lived in a different environment? When I was growing up, I saw drug dealers and those being the individuals that were successful. So I agree with what Deputy Chief Maggie says, is that we need to shed light on showing what success looks like and highlighting how education, because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We want to be able to put food on our tables, and we all want the same thing. No matter what color you are, we all want the same things, but how do we go about getting it, right? And sometimes the deck is stacked differently, so we need to be really in those environments saying, I grew up here, but I found education to be the key for me. And if you want that car, you want those things, and you want to keep it, education is the way to go.
Daryl, you shared that you served some time in the system. You shared yesterday you have a son who's 6'10", who wants to be a police officer. So what was that conversation about?
Yeah, that was a rough one, man. We're still working on that, man. We want to be a lawyer or something, but
We're gonna fly the wall. I had that conversation.
but that's his thing. And ever since he was little, he wanted to be a police officer, and because he wants to make change, and I have to support him. He's 6'10", so I'm hoping that the conversation is there's no police cars that's gonna fit you. So maybe you want to do something different.
But what do you tell him seriously? What was your first reaction to it? He said, "Dad, he won't want to be a cop."
No, I want you to be a good cop. I want you to be I want you to make change. I want you to tell them the story about your dad. I want you to tell them what it was like to visit your father in prison. That's the kind of cop I want to have an interaction with when he's interacting with a dad. That's the kind of police officer I want to interact with somebody that's had that lived experience. I've known police officers who said, I remember what it was like only talking to my dad for 15 minutes. I knew what he meant. The phone calls are only 15 minutes long. So I knew what he meant. So those interactions, so when that situation happens and he's interacting with that dad, we don't even ask those questions. Are you a father? Or, that's not, the whole time, even from arrest all the way through court, no one even asked if I was a father. No one asked if me being incarcerated was going to affect others' lives. That didn't matter. And that's not a conversation. These conversations need to happen early and figuring out where our goal is to put people back on track. Bad behavior is bad behavior, but understanding why the behavior happens and how do we prevent it from happening again.
And again, we want to hear from you all, so don't be shy. We want to hear candid conversations, an observation. I'm sure something here we find compelling. We're in a small room here, so feel comfortable speaking your piece. Yes? Okay.
Good evening. I have a question for the panel based on the stat Stan brought up earlier about 80+% of police calls largely being for things that might not be what we think of modern policing. And we saw in the video that there's a bit of a push, right, to move policing maybe towards the Austin model, finding other ways, other interventions, other people that can respond to certain situations. What's your reaction to, we know that we live in a complicated world, and we also know that there will be an incident where a social worker shows up to a scene, and it turns out somebody has a weapon, and they end up shot, and it's all over the news, right? And because we saw that happen in Connecticut in the wake of the Cheshire murders, right? The whole system shut down in response to one incident. So I just wonder, how do you think about how do we get to a place where we can have progress, we can find interesting ways to reimagine police, knowing some of the landmines that are ahead of us. So just curious for your thoughts on that.
Thanks, Ken. Anybody? And I can talk about that.
How do you solve the problem? Give us one bullet point to Ken's question.
Is there a solve? I don't think that's a solve. I think that every day we have friends in all different fields. There are people that work in mental health facilities all the time that are brutally attacked. Things happen. There's teachers that disarm people. We talk about training because it's interesting when we start to talk about other professions that interact with people with mental health challenges, that interact in dangerous situations, yet they somehow successfully come out of those situations. And unfortunately, we would hate for something like that to happen, but we do have people who have some serious mental health challenges. We just had someone, incident where a young person actually fatally hurt his mother. So these things do happen, but when we want the best person at the time to be at the scene. I think that's my opinion, that the best person at the scene. We can't prevent everything, but I think we have a great opportunity to provide people with what they need. When we start to talk about equity, equity is giving the person what they need at that moment. And a lot of times that person, whether it be a person with lived experience or a person with a mental health background, that's what that individual needs, not somebody that comes up here that may be actually frightened them, that could escalate the situation.
It's really equity and empathy, right? You have both those things at play in order to do this. I'm going to start calling on people since some of you are shy. I'm going to start calling on people to give me their thoughts or a question. The question here, and then Miss, I'm going to let you, since you're writing and scribbling, I want to know what the heck you're writing. So we'll get to the minute. I'm going to go to you first. Over here, stand up, please, and give your question or comment.
Never bring a pen to stage show.
What is she writing?
I thought of when you had said somebody showing up as a social worker perhaps there's an issue and they get physically injured, I'd say the chances of that happening are very low compared to if a policeman shows up with his training to do what he does and a gun. Because I think they're prone to violence, and I think they're a danger to our system in general. When the gentleman was speaking in blue about communicating with people with autism spectrum disorder, or whatever you want to call it, and other things, I think that's important that they have training on how to deal with different, everybody communicates differently. And I think, honestly, where the problem may lie, and I don't know as a professional, because I'm not a professional in that, I think respect and the fact that everybody communicates a bit differently is important. And nobody fits this cookie cutter thing. I don't know how police are trained. I don't think I want to know anymore because I think they just make things worse. And I think there needs to be huge changes, but I think they lack respect. And I think they must be taught to have in some way or other, not to empathize and not to really de-escalate, because I don't see that happening. I don't.
Dr. Ann, that's your forte here, right? The issue of
I think it's a systemic
training.
issue.
Right, the issue of training really does start at training, right? Have we really changed our training, or are we just talking about it? But it really starts with training people to be empathetic, to de-escalate, not antagonize. So the gun's there is a very last resort. So speak more of the training, and is that taking any kind of traction? The issue of transforming training.
Yeah, I think that's a huge part of the national discussion right now. But I really think it goes back to also the tools to allow agencies to understand how to do it, right? So for example, we've been in a lot of conversations about number of hours towards a content area, right? And I've always sort of said, but what really matters is what you do during those hours, right? And so are we doing scenario-based training where you are talking to someone who has a disability, and then you're being debriefed or evaluated on how you communicated, which is different than 15 hours of lecture, right? And so we're still thinking about how do we quantitatively measure the number of hours in training, which I think is a really good start, right? Because we haven't even historically done a great job of doing that, right? Yet then I think you have to move the conversation to what are you doing within the hours, right? And then what is sort of the evaluation and how are we giving, because these are individuals who will become police officers, right? We're going to graduate, and so how are we giving them sort of the learning in those environments where hey, they may not get it right the first time, right? And we've seen that with our use of force scenarios or duty to intervene, right? What do they do when they're confronted with an officer, in this case, who's an actor who is using excessive force? What do they do, right? How do they know how to also report? All of those types of things are really important. So it's more than just the number of hours, but what are they doing in the training? And then I think the key part, to kind of touch on the question or the comment on, I don't know if I want to know, is how are we transparent about what we're doing, right? Because it's really not up to the public to, knock on everyone's door and ask, how do you train police? But it's saying, here are the things that we're doing to demonstrate, these are the things that we're doing so that the public is informed, so that they can feel safe knowing, hey, if I know that my officer is being trained in this way and I have that education, do I feel more comfortable, right? And if I don't, what is the sort of feedback loop to actually say, I want more hours, or I want more scenario-based training, or I want something different. And so that's sort of my answer on that one.
So really different situational training. We know that officers go through training, situational, where you have to shoot, cover, protect your partner. But great basketball coaches and football coaches, they'll do the same kind of thing where they'll say, okay, there's 5 seconds left. You're on this yard line here. We're going to practice so that you get used to that pressure and how to respond. So when the game comes and an athlete hits a 50-foot shot and everyone's wild, they practice this thing over and over again. So you're really talking about different situational training where you're dealing with someone on the spectrum or dealing with someone who has an invisible disability, and then how to better decipher that, right?
Stan?
Yes.
Stan?
Oh, yes, sir.
Just in speaking to what Dr. Ann said and what you said, and my new best friend with the orange on said about the training, and the number one thing that you said was about respect. and there are 5 black men in this room. If you asked any of us what was a real key thing to us, it would be respect. We want to be respected because in this country, culturally, right? We talk about cultural training, right? Respect is like number one to us. Like, and when you're poor, sometimes that's all you have, right? So imagine if I'm being interacted with a law enforcement, I'm being engaged with law enforcement. I walk out with all I have is that respect. He engages me and he's looking for respect. He just left though. He wants to be respected, but somehow there's this disconnect. And the respect. Now I'm feeling disrespected, he's feeling disrespected. That situation is going to escalate really quickly. So if you understand that black men, black people, people of color, their number one thing is they want respect. So automatically that training needs to be exclusively about how to respect somebody when you engage a person of color, because they're coming out with that at the forefront. Sometimes that's all we have. So that training is more than 8 hours, right? And it's going to be inclusive of people with color. So you understand when you engage somebody, hey, Mr. McGraw, you know what? My name is Officer so-and-so, this is what's going on. And we're explaining that respect level, that engagement, I would bet everything that engagement will less likely end up where someone's getting hurt. You know, and that's not happening. That's not happening. You know what I mean? So I think that it's important that I love when you said respect because it takes me back to there. Because you know, when I am engaged with a police officer, whether I have a suit on, whether I have 50 letters behind my name, I'm always in de-escalation mode. Every time, every interaction, no matter what, if it's pleasant or not, I'm in de-escalation mode. I'm conscious of where my hands are. I'm conscious of what I'm saying. I'm always conscious of all these things. So
but the reality is black men that's different for black men. Not every man goes to that. Now you're making a very important point that black males are more sensitive, more tuned to that, where someone else wouldn't. You mentioned the issue of respect. I think it's very important. You mentioned, police also will tell you, talk to them, they'll say, well, one thing we want is our respect. So then the question is, both people want respect, right? The folks in blue want respect, but when they're disrespected, they have guns and then batons. When someone doesn't have a weapon and they're disrespected, they have their mouth, and so they may end up saying some words that they shouldn't say. So the question is, what happens when you're disrespected as a black male, Latino male, female, and disrespected as a police officer? What's the next course? Because too many times disrespect leads to violence, leads to anger, leads to people getting hurt and killed.
Right.
Well,
Chief, your thoughts? What's that?
The police officer's on the clock. I would think he's being paid to deal with things properly, and if he feels disrespected, not to act out. I mean, he's on the clock.
But they're human. They're going to say they're human, they have emotions, they're going to have that human mentality, right? So back to training with that. You're human, you're trained on this, but what happens when your training doesn't kick in and your humanity does not kick
Their
in?
emotions, yeah.
Right, the emotions kick
Their
in.
reactions.
Chief?
So beyond being human, obviously we're human, but what I like to remember always, and I tell people remember, is that officers are not called and invited to grandma's 100th birthday to celebrate and eat cake. They're called when the birthday goes wrong and everybody's fighting and somebody stabs each other. We go to calls at the worst moment. We're not there from the inception. We are not there to intercept when things start going wrong. Those are resources that have been already cut from the community. And they've been laying more and more on police officers to do with 4 hours of training. I have a nephew in the spectrum, and I went to the academy first, and I had my training on autism and stuff like that. What he's gone through in his life from he's 13 years old right now was never covered in that training. And I've learned a lot just from learning in that lived experience. But the fact is that officers are human, and yes, we are being trained to de-escalate. We're being trained to de-escalate in a perfect environment, in a role play, where everything is controlled. When sincerely, when you learn the most is when you're in the middle of screaming husband and wife, and you're trying to separate them, and you're waiting for your backup. Because when you learn the most is when you are holding someone crying. I will never forget the first time I held a woman who died in my arms after being shot 4 times by her husband. I used to be a municipal police officer in the town of Salford before I went to UConn. And she'll always be with me. And there's an anger and there's a sorrow and there is pain that goes with that. There's officers that go through a lot. And I think one of the problems is that we're not having that conversation of the officers' own mental health and what they need to support to make sure that those layers don't keep accumulating, then they explode because they are human, because they already have way too many drops thrown in that cup and it's overflowing. So I ask that, yes, we are trained, but what happens in a controlled environment of a classroom does not compare. I've been to situations that there is nothing the academy ever prepared me to do. And I'm like, okay, well, here we go for the ride. Let's see how this is going to turn out. I do believe, and I live by that example, that respect is key, but we are all human. I have lost my temper in 25 years. If I stood here before you and said I was never mad and upset, but I've been spit on, I have been bitten, I have been put in the hospital more than once by people I was going there to help. Not even dealing with the criminals. Those were the victims who reacted that way. So sometimes all I ask is for the patients that we are trying to change. We're not going there to make matters worse, but the fact is that the uniform is not a happy uniform. Nobody's ever happy to see a policeman or a policewoman, police person. But they're happy to see a fireman because he's going to make your house stop burning. They're going to make your day better. But everybody says a police officer is never going to make my day better. Very few people that. And that weighs on us. And that hurts us mentally and physically. In 25 years of that job, you see a lot, you carry a lot, and then you hear that you make matters worse, and it hurts. And it hurts a lot of our officers, because there's a lot of good people. Just like in the inner city, there's a lot of good people trapped in those situations. In police, there's a lot of good officers trying to do right every day. And there's only a couple that are making the news over and over and tainting what the badge is.
So to go on that, very excellent points. I've met so many police officers, friends, professionally, as you said, a large majority outstanding people, great profession. So why is it that when something goes wrong with a fellow officer, why don't the good cops, quote unquote, ever speak out against bad cops? Because they put each other in check, like a locker room situation. And say, hey, you can't do that. I mean, it would police themselves, so to speak. We wouldn't have this problem. Is the reticent to police officers? Why is that, Chief?
I think that, an issue is there is a cultural issue, but there's also that sometimes internal layers of bureaucracy in a police department.
Blue wall.
Not just the blue wall, but I will tell you sometimes is, what a lot of the police department's policy says you will not speak against your police department. You will not bring, that's not up to you. That's up to your chiefs and the chiefs to do. So they're told to be quiet and move on. This is not you. There is no reason why what happened to George should have happened. Officers should have intervened immediately when they heard. But they didn't look at it as this is somebody's son, this is somebody's brother, they just forgot. Some of them may have been in shock, some of them may have been like, I don't know what's going on here, where is my supervisor? So we need to look at those internal processes and have the officers on the street have more ability to act than they feel they do now.
But Chief, I think we got to find out what this young lady here is writing. She's writing feverishly, taking notes. So, question or comment? You're writing a lot of stuff down. What are your thoughts? What are you gleaning from this?
I think it's important. What brought me here today was talking to people from the ACLU Smart Justice campaign, and they focus mostly on prison, what's happened when people are already in prison, and making that a fulfilling experience so that they can re-enter society and be thoughtful, contributing members of society. And the more that I'm learning more about the experience with police when you first make an offense, I think we really just need to work on making every step of the law enforcement process focused on allowing the person who's doing something that's not good for the rest of society able to be more contributing.
More what?
More contributing.
More contributing.
Rather than.
We think contributing meaning, so if you're arresting me, if I'm the person who's causing a problem, make sure I'm clear what you're saying, that I should be more.
That you're able to understand why wrong for the other people. Because that's why we have laws.
So accountability, really.
Yeah.
Make sure that I understand the consequences for what I did. Here's why we're here. Here's what you did, and here are the consequences. Let's kind of talk about this.
And you
right?
have the resources so that you don't have to make those same mistakes again.
Great observation. Great observation. Anyone else? And feel free to add some more. Yeah, Ken, over here. This right over the head. Yes.
I guess my question has to do with like great ideas, proposals, whether it be mental health counselors, but like there always seems like there's a cost that's attached to it, and at some point you have to be able to come up with the resources or reallocations of funding in order to make some of these things happen. So what is the pitch to whether it's like city councils, city voters versus like suburban voters, that whether there's money available or money needs to be made available so that some of these things can actually be implemented?
Who wants that one? Let's see Dr. Ann taking her hand. Resources. Oh, Dr. Megan too? You guys good?
So great question, thank you, in terms of resources. So I'll go back to the specific role of social workers in crisis response. I'm thinking specifically of a small town in Kentucky, Alexandria, Kentucky, I think population around 16,000. And the former police chief there actually petitioned the town government to provide for a social worker. And he did so because of the crisis call volume was such that he was seeing his law enforcement officers, speaking of the burden that was placed on them, he said, you know what, let's get the police back to doing what they do best, which is responding to criminal acts, rather than incidents that occur directly because of a mental health crisis. So in that case, the former police chief actually petitioned the town government to provide for monies for the hiring of one social worker. And now, in 2021, they actually have two. In some other localities that we've looked at, they've either hired in-house, so within a police department, they've actually expanded their budget. Typically, that maps onto larger municipalities, which have broader budgets. In smaller localities, they've actually become very creative, and they've been able to contract out with a social worker or crisis intervention team, again, depending upon their budgets. So it is a matter of resources, but when we look at the variety of towns and cities, there are a number of ways that they've come up with the monies to provide for that community resource.
When we say resources, sometimes it's not about new resources, but reallocating what's already there, right? Social services, police, make some shifts where it can kind of work and complement each other. I know Dr. Andy wanted to add to it, but I want to get Jonathan in real quick, just on the idea of embedding more social workers in the police daily interaction. To have a SWAT team, if you will, of social workers who are there working in concert with police, so that they can, as Dr. Megan was saying, say it's more of a social work call. We'll just kind of stand back and your thoughts on that, and how what's the political. How do political winds go if you were to propose something like that?
How do the political winds go?
Would that be something received favorably? You said, hey, let's make this police thing more where it's police, and we have a vision of social work right on the wing here. So we're all in one building, and when the call comes, the dispatcher will assess it, and we'll send out either an officer social worker, or a social worker.
Well, I think that the concept politically would be accepted. Absolutely, but any I think virtually any human services, humanitarian related thing like that would be accepted politically just fine until you have to provide funding for it. And so you need to find funding streams to make those things happen, whether it's within a town budget, whether the state provides additional monies for it from someplace, federal funding for things like that. There's certainly, with respect to the mental health challenges or crisis really that's in this country, there have been more monies made available at the federal level. There's grant opportunities. COVID has provided funding for various things of this nature. So it's really a combination of the political will and finding the people that can research where that fund, and that's the challenge, I think. But having people that can research, well, where can this funding come from, and where can I get creative where this funding says it's kind of for this box, but maybe this fits. And that's where the challenge, I think, comes from. Conceptually, I think it's something that would be accepted by anybody. You got to find the money for it.
And Ken, I know you had a question. Dr. Ann wanted to pipe in on this part here.
Yeah.
Come to Ken after Dr. Ann.
I was just going to comment, I think that's exactly right, is figuring out where the money's coming from, which sometimes might be projecting into the future what that change would be, right? So if you think about lawsuits, right, related to whether it be sexual harassment, whether it be use of force, but if you can actually implement real, responses that will reduce the likelihood of these incidences, then the city will likely be paying out less in the future, right? So it's making those types of compelling arguments by saying if we know on average this changes this outcome, right? You're actually saving more money in the future if you invest in this now, right? Also, I think the other thing that is pretty fair is that across the board, whether it's fair or not, social workers cost less than sworn officers, right? And so if you're actually doing a one-for-one model on this and saying you can divert this, you're then also knowing that a master's of social work is paid for by the individual who's now being employed. So you're not also spending 9 months training them in the academy before they're actually, maybe even close to a year where they're then being able to be a sworn officer on their own, where you're saying you've already had the training, now we have to figure out how to train you to do this particular job. So there are a lot of advantages, but it's figuring out how to work with the departments and with the city to really understand, why are we doing this, what is the intended outcome, and then what potentially is the benefit.
Ken. Yes, sir. I'll get you in a second. Mr. Ken, the gentleman over here.
I have a specific question for the Deputy Chief and Dr. Kringen in particular, but before I get to that, I just want to say on this topic that, there's been a lot of conversation, I think, across Connecticut in particular about, right, it's been framed as a crisis in policing, right, inability to people to be attracted to the job, having a harder time hiring candidates, attrition, lots of officers leaving, and I think that one of the things that maybe we need to start doing is to not think about it in terms of a crisis, but instead as an opportunity, right? Maybe it presents an opportunity to take some of those resources and invest in some of the things we're talking about. So I just wanted to help try and provide a different frame for that. But my specific question for the Deputy Chief and Ann is on a little bit of a different topic. The Deputy Chief before had been talking about how her department now currently is much younger than it was years ago. And you're running an academy essentially. I'm wondering if you could identify the one thing that you think officers that are coming out of training today are still deficient in. What would that be? What's the one thing that, an officer who's got less than 5 years of experience, this is what they're really lacking? And maybe on the other side of that, what's the one deficiency that you see in officers that have been around a while? But I'm really interested in your perspective. What are young people lacking when they enter the profession today?
So I will tell you that several years ago, and I have a PhD, so making this comment, I think I stand very well on making this comment, is the fact that we have focused on wanting a lot of education for police officers. And what's happening is that individuals are going to college, they're getting out of high school, going to college and getting the job, and they miss that lived experience. They haven't had real jobs. They don't know what it is to work double shifts. Not yet. They're not in police yet. And get home and deal with children's stuff, wife, spousal problems. They don't know what it is sometimes to be in the other side of the coin. So they lack empathy. They don't understand the issues. And the academy, the escalation again is taught in a very perfect world. And we know none of us live in a perfect world. We all have problems, economical, family, illnesses, and things that often are not seen. So I think that we have a lot more educated officers that are not really understanding what our community goes through on a day-to-day basis, right? And that's a problem. And then de-escalation is in a perfect world.
Sir, do you have a question?
Watching a lot of YouTube videos on traffic stops that went wrong, and basically it seemed to me like a majority of the time it's not the police's fault, basically. Like they would tell the person being stopped, oh, please step out of the car, show me your license, and the guy kept going, why did you stop me, or what's wrong, or I don't want to give you this is my right, and when in fact they could be doing this after the fact. At the time, you should just listen to what the police officer is saying, and if you have an issue, you can either take the police officer's badge number, complain to the police chief, and I think like a lot of these issues could be not end badly if you just listen to what you're being told at the time and just comply with the rules.
You know, it's back to the respect issue that Daryl raised, that really respect is key, right? When you're stopped at a police stop and you don't know why, you're upset and you feel you're disrespected off the jump because now you're being stopped, you're not sure why. The officer comes and then it just kind of goes downhill from
Can I
there.
have your attention, please? The time is 7:50 and the kids' place will be closing in 10 minutes at 8 o'clock. The rest of the library will remain open until 9 p.m.
All right, we have
Please
10
gather
minutes.
your children's materials for checkout.
8 minutes.
Oh no, it's all over again, right?
I think to your point, Daryl was saying that respect is so key because every side wants respect. So that guy in the car pulled over, feels disrespected, so he pops off or doesn't want to comply. And now the cop feels disrespected because he's just trying to do his or her job. And then there's the questions from there, what then happens, right? Once you're disrespected, where's the training come in that, okay, as a police officer, you're disrespected, what's your next level of action? And to your point, for the community, how do you better comport yourself when you have a stop that you think is unfair? What do? You know, you just can't, I won't say the word.
It just seems that in those situations that the blame always falls on the police officers, where nobody talks about if you're just giving him your license, like what was the big deal?
Well, it depends on who's watching the video. Sometimes, a lot of times the blame is on the cop. A lot of times folks say what they're saying. Hey, that guy, all you do is just comply and you wouldn't have gotten shot. So it's both sides, depending on who's watching the video.
Right, it is the lens. It is the lens. It's interesting when you hear people say that, well, he should have just done this. Well, a lot of times those videos only depict one piece, and it's the engagement. And if you've ever been pulled over for DWB, driving while black, then that, after a while, gets a little frustrating, right? Especially if you know that this wasn't something that you were doing, and that engagement of, you know, where you're trying to do that. There's many times where I've been in a situation where I understand, I feel like I'm educated, I know how to communicate, I'm a communicator, and I did all the right things and still was being disrespected and treated at a level, like, to the point that I'm like, really? But I wanted to just add to that financial question that my friend in the back asked in reference to, and I know Andrew's going to say the same thing, because if you worked at the IMRP long enough, we talk about justice reinvestment, and I know hopefully we're going to talk a little bit about that. But if I'm a person, let's just say hypothetically for the sake of this conversation, it costs $50,000 to house an inmate, right? And we create programs that individual doesn't end up back in prison. It's $50,000 that we save. We have not, as taxpayers, all of us in here should be wondering where those funds being directed to, not back into the coffer, but back into communities that we could actually establish other and continue programs. So, okay, so I'm not going back to prison. I haven't been in prison in, I don't know, almost 15 years now. So I've saved the state a considerable amount of money that should be invested in my community in social service programs, right? Because there's $50,000 that's no longer being utilized for that. COVID, as my friend John mentioned, right? We've lowered the numbers of people that are incarcerated in Connecticut due to COVID. Where's that funding? Where's that money? Right? You don't have the same amount of people. We're seeing prisons closed every day. We don't have the same amount of people in prison, yet their budget is sky high. Where's that money going? So we need you and more people to continuously advocate for when we talk about redirecting funds back into those communities that are high, where they see high recidivism, where they see high rates of incarceration. That money, would you rather the money be in the prison or in those communities, right? Where we can actually create productive citizens that could be taxpayers, that could add to our roles, instead of having this, one of our highest line items in the state of Connecticut is prisons. Why?
That's a very good point. You know, when I was reporting, very good point, Daryl, that I realized when, at the time when the state was cutting, there was a time there where funds were being cut, this is like that what the time frame was, but one budget item was always exploding. Department of Corrections, so.
Gentleman in the back. He's got his hand, there's a gentleman in the back.
Oh,
it's gonna fall off. We gotta make sure we get it.
It's not gonna fall.
I got it first.
I do have some thoughts.
Thank you,
on it. And I just would have everybody think about this. COVID has thrown us for a loop, right? There are things happening in this state that people are demanding action on. And the question I think we have to ask ourselves is how are we going to react to that? We've reacted to that in the past in this country by a punishment schema, which resulted in the U.S. being the highest jailer in the nation. When we look across the country at best practices, we miss what the rest of the world is doing. And I would highlight an article in the New York Times, it's also been in a lot of places, the radical humanity of Norway's prison system. And they have one of the lowest prison populations in the world. When people are in there, they get services, and when they leave, they're better off for society. And the question that we have to ask ourselves, are we going to trust each other as human beings? Are we going to trust human dignity and respect is the way out of this? Or do we think that a punishment schema is the way out of it? Because we know where that leads. We had that happen in Connecticut, where we had 20,000 people in prison. We were spending billions of dollars. And what does that mean? That means that your kid going to college is going to be spending more. That means you're not going to have money for roads and bridges. That means you're not going to have money for a lot of the things that we need funding for. And so when we are faced with these crises and we see people doing things, I don't think anybody questions the accountability part of it. People need to be held accountable. But the question is, are we going to meet them with love and respect and understanding, which actually leads to better outcomes? Or are we going to go back into a punishment schema which only, frankly, punishes ourselves and ends up in this loop where there's no way out of it? And you talk about money being available in COVID, Alabama is still in that loop. The Build Back Better plan, you know what they're doing with some of those funds? They're building 3 new prisons. Do we think we can do better than that? I think it's the question.
Great question. Great question and a great way. And don't forget, too, while we were exploding with our prison population, we were building so many prisons, we had to start farming prisons out of state because we were just building these prisons, locking folks up, and we started bringing them out to Virginia and places where there were abuse issues there. And then the state got sued because there were a couple of inmates who got killed at out-of-state prisons. So it just kind of, became this quagmire. Right. But anyway, Andy, we have 2 minutes left, and I want to thank the panel for your great work with this. I appreciate it. Thank the audience, TV folks. Andrew, you want to close this out? And we have 8 o'clock. They're going to shut the doors on us, so you better.
Sure. Well, just thank you, everybody. There's the QR code right there that can pull up a survey on your phone. We actually have also surveys that are just regular paper copies if people would like to do it. We want to know, was this useful to you? Did more people need to hear it? What did we miss? And so it's just really important for us. So, and thank you. Take some food home with you, please. Thank you.
Let me get it for Daryl. You'll run there.
I'm going.